So do you have any other examples of areas where intuition fails?
Right. Well, I discussed the coin rotation paradox in other podcasts. I believe the sort of interview that we did on the delicate war, but not to rehash that. Well, one that I really like is the birthday paradox or the birthday problem. And that's, how many random people do you have to have in a room before you find two people with the same birthday? And this is a really counterintuitive one. It only takes 23 people to reach a 50-50 chance that two people have the same birthday,
Yeah, that is a surprising result.
right? And with just 70 people, you reach a 99.9% probability.
So when you look at something like that, it's often a matter of writing out some mathematical notation and then
Yeah.
kind of compelling someone to see that though it is contrary to their intuition, it must be the case.
Right.
So I feel like what we're dealing with in a lot of cases like that is we go from what we visualize, what our hunch is, into
Mm,
that abstract space where we actually are able to grab hold of something of a finer texture with our mind, to touch that finer texture.
right. Well, like with the earlier example, with the string girdling the earth, I really find that the mathematics is totally unconvincing. It's like, yeah, that equation works out, but the hunch or the intuitive answer just seems to have so much more of a kind of satisfying reality to it.
Uh, I completely feel where you're coming from. I mean, when you think that this is one of the things that haunted Schrodinger, right? Schrodinger was one of the founders of quantum mechanics, but he couldn't accept it.
Right. I'd have to say, of course, we've brought up a number of different counterintuitive examples that involve mathematics, but I'd have to say that my favorite types are not so much mathematical as psychological. There are a lot more counterintuitives than just kind of abstract puzzles. Like all of the stuff in game theory and behavioral economics, those kinds of things. Where you find out that what you thought you would do in a situation is what you would not do. So there are a lot of counterintuitive examples in those fields that let you learn a little bit more about the opacity of ourselves to ourselves.
Yeah, that's a great point. Kind of like worrying is wishing for what you don't want.
Yeah. Certainly in affairs of the heart, there are all kinds of really strange relationships, like one peg, then another peg, and there's a string between them. But when you pull the string, some unrelated peg elsewhere rotates.
Well, I feel like what a lot of this points to is the way in which our consciousness has
Uh-huh.
a notion of what a state of affairs is, and it's quite often quite wrong.
Right.
And I feel like that goes back to the idea of Plato's cave
Yeah.
and the idea that it's important to study mathematics, to study geometry, to move towards an ability to conceptualize on a more abstract level.
Right. And to study psychology and introspect to learn more about itself.
Absolutely. Well, I think some of what's going on in philosophy in the Republic, for example, when they just when they talk about the parts of the soul and so forth, that's not
Yeah.
logically deduced.
Hmm.
That is introspection, and it's phenomenological, if you will.
Right.
Like the whole school of phenomenology is like letting beholding what beholding what is shown, including the mind itself, which I think makes it a close cousin to Buddhist meditation in a certain way.
Yeah.
Plato had this concept of this dividing line between just living in your imagination and living through the higher reaches of the intellect. And the way to that higher level was largely through the discipline of geometry.
Mm-hmm.
But as we were just saying, though, there was also a kind of phenomenological component to it. I mean, where does this idea about the soul come from? It's not deduced. But I think that Kant erred in a certain way through his understanding of his own imagination, or his lack of understanding of the limits of his own imagination.
Huh.
By thinking of time and space as kind of categories of our experience, it's as if he put a limit on what spatial reality actually is. And this is a passage from Rudy Rucker. Basically, Kant was arguing that geometry is Euclidean. He argued for Euclid's fifth postulate. Euclid's fifth postulate, there's different ways of expressing it. I like Playfair's axiom, which is
Mm-hmm.
basically given a line A and a point not on line A, there is at most one line that can be drawn through that point, which is parallel to line A. So this is
Yeah.
Rucker on Kant. His argument for the truth of the fifth postulate was that space is largely a creation of our own minds, and that we cannot imagine non-Euclidean space, and hence space is Euclidean, i.e., it satisfies the fifth postulate. Kant thought we couldn't because no one had at that time when he wrote that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Kant, however, was wrong. We can imagine non-Euclidean space, and actually multiple types of non-Euclidean spaces, but no one had up to that point.
Mm.
So he was reasoning from his limited capacity to imagination, to imagine something, and I think that goes back to errors of reasoning from pictures, which goes back to exactly why the string wrapped around the earth is so counterintuitive for us.
Mm-hmm. It seems that related to that, that one of the sort of, we give all kinds of junk food to the intuition, rather than the proper nutrition, as I talked about earlier. And one of those types of junk food seems to be common sense or status quo or that kind of thing.
Well, I don't know who the physicists were, but there's a story that a German physicist once said to a British physicist that a British physicist will never be able to understand relativity. And the British physicist said, yeah, that's because we have too much common sense.
Right. Well, in that case, it turns out that common sense is what gets in the way of you being able to understand what's really going on.
Well, they also say that children can often imagine hyperspace
Mm.
better than adults.
Huh. That's interesting.
And part of that could be that their minds are still developing. So the nature of space is still kind of open to them. It's still kind of an open question because their spatial perception is still developing. So that, we're a little bit more hardened and rigid.
Right.
Although things to me are still not spatially obvious. So
Mm.
I think that's why I have a tendency to go into the abstract.
Yeah. This line came to me the other day. I was thinking about the purity. That's not the exact word. What is it? The sort of guiltlessness of children, their purity in that sense. And this line came to me that they are before good and evil. It's all a little bit more like jelly. There's a lot.
Well, you're reminding me a little bit of William Blake.
Right. The innocence. Innocence is the word I was actually looking for.
Yeah,
Yeah, but they are, their experience of reality is more moldable than ours.
yeah, right. So it makes me wonder because I've definitely seen what I would call evil from kids,
Yeah.
but I also saw it being encouraged by an adult.
Yeah, there is that. I mean, that gets back to there was this whole sort of long line of people criticizing Artie Lang and saying, that he's saying, the parents are bad, but there there are also family situations in which the children are driving the parents crazy. Of course, it never really, stands as a criticism. I mean, he was investigating one type of, familial relationship. And, by doing that, it wasn't as if he was saying that other types don't exist. But yeah, you get into all of the weird mutual ways, the sort of feedback loops between parents and children, and that you can have these weird, like, parent influences child who influences parent and so on.
Yeah.
The idea that I had of the innocence being before good and evil rather than beyond good and evil is just that it's pre-differentiated.
Right. No, I completely agree with you, and that's where I think William Blake comes in as well.
Mm-hmm. And so that pre-differentiation, I wanted to link to what you were discussing, that children seem to be able to imagine hyperspace more easily than adults.
There's more potential
Right.
in that sense. Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, I didn't mean it as if maybe it sounded as if I was disagreeing with you.
No, I didn't think so.
Okay, yeah. It's creating the cultural contexts for that evil to manifest, and in a certain, it's a kind of in the sense that it's also more unconscious.
Right.
Like they become conscious of evil to a certain degree by actually doing evil.
Right.
I mean, I have memories of things that I've done that suddenly strike me. It irritates me, things from long ago, and it's as if I was not really conscious. And then I become conscious through the irritation to my conscience.
Right. Well, one thing I wanted to bring up, because it's almost like this podcast is like we're wearing 10-ounce boxing gloves and the intuition is tied up in the corner and we're sort of mobster beating the crap out of it. I thought we should also talk about the power of intuition.
Okay, well, so here's a question, because I mean, you could go with a very generic definition of intuition where it's the ability to acquire knowledge without recourse to conscious reasoning.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a flash.
Right.
Suppose I've been thinking about something and I don't get it, and my mind, some part of my mind is working on it. It's like in the back of my mind, it's kind of on the back burner, if
Right.
you will. And then I'm going for a walk, and then I have an aha moment.
Right.
Is that aha moment intuition?
Right. That's a good question, and that becomes a really big topic, because is we could say that the intuition is the unconscious, but then what is the unconscious? We get into all these kinds of it almost becomes semantic at that point. I mean, trying to pinpoint the intuition, because we have those sorts of things. We come to solutions to problems in our sleep as well. So then, do we call that intuition, or do we call it the unconscious, or do we call it the unconscious manifest in dream?
Yeah, I mean, scientists have had visions of solutions in dreams.
Right. There was that interesting example of Don Newman, the mathematician, who solved and published an intractable math problem through a dream in which John Nash revealed to him how to solve it.
That is very interesting. It also reminds me of when people have dreams, it's just someone chasing after them,
Mm-hmm.
and they say stop and ask, "Well, what do you want?"
Right.
That what's chasing after you is some aspect of yourself.
Mm.
Maybe it's not reducible to that, but
Right.
that, I mean, the John Nash appearing to him is would your interpretation of that be that it's a way for some aspect of his psyche to communicate with another aspect of his psyche?
Yeah, that I think that's a fair description of it. I mean, it's only one way of looking at it. He might have been, contacting the ghost of John Nash, but yeah, I would tend to agree with that.
Right.
A lot of the parts are just not connected typically, and when they do become connected, for example, I think that's, if I'm not mistaken, there's something to the way that the brain connections are made when a person takes psychedelics that's very different than the typically unconnected normal brain.
Right.
But you bringing up the scientists makes me think of something. There's this one of my favorite books of all time is William Beveridge's The Art of Scientific Investigation. Have you ever read that?
I haven't.
It's really it gets into all sorts of things. It's really a sort of broad, wide ranging work. One thing that he talked about is that, well, he did a survey of scientists at the time. This was in the 1950s when scientists meant more than something like a data entry clerk. I mean, a lot of science jobs today are just, you learn the protocol to avoid contamination, and then you just go about collecting data day in and day out. I mean, a long time ago, I wanted to go into psychedelic research as a scientist. That was like the occupation that I was looking at, and I I attempted to get in touch with Carrie Mullis to discuss it. And anyway, I talked to a lot of people that were, in the sciences at the time, and they basically told me, that I would just be like running psychedelic substances through like I don't know, a chromatograph or something, like just recording data. And, obviously I decided that wasn't really something interesting. It wasn't a career I wanted to pursue. But it does feel like there's been this substantive shift in what science is, where like there was a lot more exploration, and you could even say self-experimentation back in the day compared to now. But anyway, where was I? The art of scientific investigation, right? He did a survey of scientists in the 1950s, and he found that half of scientists use intuition in their work, and 30% of them use it frequently.
Say that again.
Half of scientists use intuition in their work, and 30% use it frequently. It's like, Terence McKenna brought up the idea that science itself was the fruit of Descartes' dream about the angel of truth. And then you find that one of the main ways of knowing or working in science is intuitionally.
Yeah, I remember that story. Wasn't he coming back from the attack on the Winter King?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. McKenna gave the quote as, "The conquest of nature is to be achieved through measure and number." That's what the angel told him in his dream. And I wanted to use that quote in my book and
Right.
attribute it to Descartes, but I couldn't find anything online that, actually attributed it to him. Most of the quotations, of course, were from Terence McKenna. So it,
Right.
I'm not even sure if, it's true at all.
Well, I mean, okay, so going back to what you're saying about, because I think I remember that story, and that they, that I think it was Friedrich the Elector was trying to create some sort of alchemical kingdom, and that basically there was an attack on that kingdom.
Uh,
But we can that's definitely something we could go back and look at.
yeah.
But related to what we're talking about, I think that intuition can grow. That there's a kind of it's like steps in a stairway, or like rungs of a ladder,
Mm,
with the ladder growing. That intuition, as the crystallized knowledge is growing, the intuition is able to reach a little bit further into the leading edge.
right.
I mean, if you look at musicians and studying intricate chord progressions and different scales and arpeggios they can play over chords, and going through this very analytical
Mm-hmm.
process, you can reach a level where there's a kind of intuitive flowering where they're not really thinking anymore.
Right. Yeah, it seems. I was actually just going to ask you what you thought about the connection between composing and the intuition. It definitely seems to me to be an intuitional process, and of course, that is fed by the analytical processes that you just talked about.
Right, like you were talking. Right, like you were talking before about what are you feeding your mind?
Right. Well, just to bring this back to Beveridge, a little bit of a winding path, but reading that a lot of science is performed with intuition itself seems almost counterintuitive. It seems like at first glance, like something like rationality would be a better type of way of seeing the world, of trying to experiment with the world and so on. But, well, rationality, when it is available to us, is a more explanatory way, or I should say, it comes with a list of decisions or weighings that we made so that we can go back and investigate it later, whereas we don't really know the internal workings of intuition. But to me, each way of seeing or experiencing the world is incomplete, especially because we lead singular mortal lives. When you have a few seconds to make a life or death situation, you can't compute your way down every branch of the decision tree and eventually come to an answer. Or, like, to kind of relate your music example to martial arts or fighting, you have your training, the muscle memory, as they call it, and all of that. But what happens if the opponent does something that you haven't seen before, that you don't know the meaning of? You need to react immediately, and that is going to be intuition and training, not rationality. Of course, there are different fields or situations in which rationality doesn't, where it's not really relevant, or it doesn't really have much to give us, like in spontaneity or the affairs of the heart. And Beveridge discusses a lot of problems in the art of scientific investigation. He presents the problems with rationality, with intuition. He gives a lot of interesting examples of how each one can go wrong. And as far as rationality, he discussed how most scientific discoveries to present have been made by playing around with things, just empirical experimentation, but that rationality has often gotten in the way of discovery because of adherence to incorrect dogma.
I guess my question though is that actually being rational? Because to me, if the scientific method is really you're supposed to go out into the unusual cases that don't seem to cohere with the current theory and chip away at that.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think that rigidity is synonymous with rationality. I think it can become synonymous with somebody's notion of rationality. Do you know what I mean? More someone's notion of.
Right. The thing, I think, I mean, I agree with you, and I agree with what Beveridge is saying. So I think there's just a little bit of like a kind of terminology difference. If you reason your way through an argument, say, but the one of the first axioms is actually incorrect, you were being rational, but you come to the wrong answer because of that incorrect axiom. And I think that's what Beveridge is talking about.
Right. So that's kind of that's one way of looking at that is the difference between an argument being valid and an argument really being sound.
Right.
So you can be reasoning through something in a valid manner, in which case you are being rational, if you want to go with that definition based on the way you're describing Beveridge.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but maybe an inability to step back and assess uh, if every point in the argument, every premise is actually um, is actually true.
Hmm.
Upon further examination, I'm not so sure about this premise. So that just sounds like there's a, distinguishing between whether an argument is valid or whether it's sound.
Right. Well, you could also say that choosing to use intuition in your work is, a rational choice.
Intuition is part of your toolkit.
It is. There's a quote I used in the Delicate War, and I thought I'd share that here. I said, or rather, I wrote, life is not a game of 100% precision. Its beauty and perplexing inscrutability often come from its ambiguity, and by the various faculties within us, the different eyes we have available to us, working in hidden and mysterious ways. We make intuitive moves. We draw connections from the air. We rely on our gut. We receive word from on high. We study. We judge based on limited experience. We draw from a constrained field of information and infer, induce, deduce, hypothesize, calculate, weigh, guess, and shield our eyes while we push the button.
Yeah, I like that. You know what it reminds me of? The brain seems to be the most integrated when the person is making music.
Now I need to get an MRI. I forgot. I was going to bring up a few examples of effective intuition. Obviously, the artistic process is, I guess, the perhaps the highest example of that. But I think it was actually in the same Beveridge book. He talked about that over 2,000 years ago, Italian farmers intuited the link between mosquitoes and malaria.
Well, now you're touching on when I think of folk wisdom and folk medicine,
Hmm.
a lot of that is of great quality.
Yeah, true.
And I'm in a camp that feels that some people who are critical of the history of the church, for example,
Uh-huh.
are often just posturing. But I think one valid criticism is maybe, well, one obvious thing is burning witches,
Yeah.
uh, but also the knowledge that a so-called witch may have had. I feel like there's been this process of alienation
Hmm.
from that deep knowledge of herbs, knowledge of nature, and we can see that when we encounter tribes
With their pseudo knowledge.
are yeah that have that knowledge that many refer to as pseudo knowledge. If it were just pseudo knowledge, they wouldn't go and ask the tribes about what plant does what. Right? The pharmaceutical corporations wouldn't be sending their people down to talk to the members of the tribe, to talk to the healers, the people with the knowledge. So there really is something to that. And I feel like that's, like even the idea of the Holy Grail seems to exist in that kind of integration of Christianity and that connection to nature.
Right.
So yeah, I absolutely think, and I mean that in some sense that may be the most powerful aspect of it of all is the intuitive relationship to nature.
Yeah, I think that might be so. It's interesting when you first listened to the CD that I put out, Apertura, you mentioned how much I seem to be getting influence from nature. And it's like something that I didn't realize at the time when I was making the music, but it was 100% true. And, looking back on it. And I think there's a connection there to be made.
Well, if you isn't that a lot of the heart of Taoism?
Yeah, yeah.
And if you look at the American tradition, like Ken Wilber basically argued America reached a kind of intellectual independence from Europe and England through Emerson.
Mm,
And if you look at Emerson, the transcendentalism is largely a kind of intuitive relationship to nature.
right.
And if you're looking at it in terms of music, it's uh, that sense of flow in nature.
Right.
And I didn't get too far in it, but I briefly looked at this book, drawing something like drawing from the right side of your brain.
Uh-huh.
It was I don't even think I have the title right, but it was basically learning to use the quote unquote right side of your brain more.
Right.
Um, but one of the things that the author said is if you go to draw something, one thing you'll notice is that it doesn't just flow. And it's like when you're starting with something, it isn't, it's kind of this, you're kind of a little bit crippled,
Mm.
but you grow through attempting. You're making those connections in your mind.
Right.
And then something grows to a point that things start to flow. It's in a sense, it's almost like you're building a vessel in the mind.
Mm.
Then it can actually, contain something or allow something to flow through it. And I think that's a lot of what happens with music. You're kind of building that structure that allows the flow to take place through the structure.
Yeah.
And so as you're working on the structure, then having that intuitive relationship to nature helps to bring about the flow.
Yeah, absolutely. In Taoism, there's this Chinese word. I forgot the Chinese pronunciation for it, but in Japanese, it's shizen, and it means naturalness or spontaneousness. And it's interesting because, well, you relate it to nature, and like the I'm just going to go in a kind of circle that moves away from that idea and then comes back to it through Alan Watts. In a lot of his books and lectures, he discussed this Chinese and Japanese word, and he thought it was interesting because the kanji, the characters that make up the word, mean something like of itself, and he saw that of itselfness in nature, and so he thought that, wow, what a perfect word the Chinese came up with for nature. The only problem is that there was no word for nature until West met East, and Westerners were like, hey, you people don't have a word for nature. Let's give you one. And, they came up with Shizen. It's actually a kind of invention based on this Western idea that there is a separation between humans and nature, that nature is some kind of separate thing. So that's the sort of move away. But this idea, of course, of itself is that, we are a part of nature. It's not like we're going out and looking at something that is separate or different from ourselves. We're looking at it and we're looking into ourselves and our own nature. And as we come from nature, we are also seeing nature in ourselves. And it feels like, to me, like that is the kind of intuitive relationship that you were talking about.
It's like the way Joseph Campbell interprets mythology.
Right, exactly.
Well, but the way that you were putting it, do you think that a word for nature emerging through the interaction of East and West is a negative development?
Yeah, I mean it's positive and negative. I mean, in the sense that I was discussing, that there's this idea, like, are we as humans a part of nature, or are we somehow separate from it? And it seems to me that the Western and Christian legacy is that we are somehow separate from it. That, we're chosen, we were God's favorite creatures, or whatever you want to say, and that is a severing of our connection to nature, in a sense. That would be the negative interpretation that I would apply to that. But when I first discussed it, I wasn't actually making a sort of a judgment call on it in that way. I just wanted to say that, well, Watts only knew enough to be dangerous, and he thought that he had this great example of, to describe the connection of Taoism to nature through this Chinese word, but it's basically a loan word from the West.
Right. Well, I guess the thing is that he can be thought provoking, but he should definitely be taken with a grain of salt.
Right. It's even hard to talk about it because when we talk about something like something being of itself or being spontaneous or whatever, we immediately think of words like natural. Then, we're back to relating it to nature.
Well, I feel like this relates to the point that I was making before about Christianity and burning witches, but also the myth of the Grail.
Hmm.
In some sense, in that integration,
Hmm.
really in some way touching the most sublime heights of the imagination. And the like Zizek's idea about certain notions of liberation
Hmm.
as, in a sense, being conditioned on the interruption. I mean, so for example, in the colonial sense, having an encounter with colonial powers help give rise to notions of liberation
Hmm.
that were beyond uh, notions of liberation prior to that encounter with colonial power.
Hmm.
It's almost like there's an element of the pre-trans fallacy at work.
Mm. I like your thought on this, the idea of the Grail and that sort of. It's almost like it reconnects Christianity with nature. And I know a lot of people have had issues with Christianity in that its weak point basically seems to be its view of the feminine. And then you have the witch burnings. And then you can also think of the earth or nature as being feminine. And curious what you think about that. Like, would you say that the Grail is like a kind of complementary that the Grail is complementary to Christianity in a way that helps it to not have such an impoverished sense of the feminine?
Well, I definitely think that Christianity has a view of the earth as if the earth is feminine.
Hmm.
And yeah, absolutely. I think the Grail, in a sense, is what is missing. I mean, I think the most interesting expression of Christianity you're going to find will be in a culture which also has some tradition of animism
Mm.
that is still active. And in a certain respect, I think that exists in Japan.
Mm. That's interesting. It makes me think of.
I think it exists in parts of Africa.
Mm. There's a famous line. I've seen like vegans and anti-vegans use the same line from the Bible, basically about how God gave us the plants and the animals to do what we want with them. And some people interpret the passages that we have dominion, that we should just shoot and eat them and burn down rainforests and do whatever the hell we want. And other people see it as a kind of the role of a steward.
Right.
Well, in either case, right? God gave nature to man as his property, like a woman.
I recently watched the original Clash of the Titans movie,
Uh,
and I really liked it. It's especially interesting. Caliban was an evil prince who was turned into this kind of hideous, gimped swamp demon, and by Zeus, and it was largely punishment because he liked hunting winged horses. And Zeus said he killed all the winged horses that, now only Pegasus remains. And I'm going to punish him. And then, his son Perseus comes and he kills Caliban and he saves the kingdom and saves the princess and everything. And he does it all riding Pegasus, the remaining horse. And he was gentle with Pegasus. I think there's a lot to be learned from that story. I mean, part of it was there was this riddle, and Well, basically, there was this curse, and anyone who wanted the hand of the princess had to be able to solve a riddle.
Uh-huh.
And if they couldn't solve it, they would basically be burned at the stake. And it turns out that the spirit of the princess was being carried in a gold cage by a vulture into the swamp to Caliban, who would basically tell her what the next riddle would be. And Perseus had a helmet that made him invisible, and he followed her there and witnessed the relaying of the riddle. And it was basically describing a ring worn by Caliban, and like describing that ring was the answer to the riddle. Like, what am I? She's describing it. It's a ring, and then, well, it's this ring. That's what you're describing. But he doesn't just answer the riddle when she asks, "What do I see in my mind's eye? What am I describing?"
Mm.
He chopped Caliban's hand off and he pulled it out from under his robe. He said, "You're describing the ring on this hand." And he threw the hand down and he said, "The curse has been lifted." Now, committed vegans say that we shouldn't ride horses at all. And I suppose that might apply to flying horses. But I think there's a lot to be learned from that story.
Yeah, it's an interesting story. Of course, I've always wondered, now that you brought it up. Okay, so veganism's what committed vegans say that we shouldn't ride horses. What do vegans say about pets?
I guess it depends on the vegan that you're talking to.
Uh,
A lot of them will argue that you shouldn't feed your pet meat either.
right, which to me seems really abusive.
Right. Yeah, I have a little bit of an issue with that because I do think there is something to the idea that there are obligate carnivores.
Right. Well, I guess some vegans are cool with riding horses, and some are cool with having pets, and some are not cool with that, and then some are cool with having a pet and feeding it meat, and some are not cool with that.
Right. No, it's a very policed group of people that they might be alienating other people if once they start peering in and just seeing, some vegans antagonizing other vegans over issues. I mean, for example, though, I mean, I for one do not eat Oreos. If I can avoid it, I don't eat palm oil because
Mm,
palm oil, from my perspective, is not vegan
mm,
because you're destroying the habitat of the orangutan.
I see.
But I mean, going back to the issue that you had, like when you were talking about the Bible, it's I still feel like I don't understand the Bible enough to even comment on it that extensively.
Right.
I feel like I have a little bit more sense of the history of the church,
Hmm.
and there are, different iterations of Christianity. But I do think overall it is kind of when at the end of the day, an integral perspective is usually the sanest perspective.
Hmm. Well, we've gone from Ken Shamrock to counterintuitive ideas, and then from there to the Holy Grail and Clash of the Titans. With a
Yeah.
little veganism thrown in. That's an interesting ride. Well, I do have I wouldn't call it purely counterintuitive, but it is related. It's almost a kind of anti-common sense or whatever, but our both of our interests in ecology come from the sort of self-relating that we feel with nature. And I think that is missing in a lot of people's consciousness.
It's true. It's true. I mean, even my relationship with my cat.
Uh-huh.
I saw an article not that long ago where it said your cat knows that you're calling it, it just doesn't care. And that made a lot of sense to me
Uh-huh.
because my cat,
Hmm.
when I call it,
Hmm.
it comes to me.
Right. Yeah, I really appreciated the way that you described that a lot of people that keep a cat as a pet, they basically just cohabitate and there isn't a relationship.
Right. Right. And if they say, well, yeah, when I call my cat, it doesn't come. It's like, yeah, that's because it's not your cat. It just lives in your house.
Right.
I mean, I can be sitting at my computer and I look over at my cat sitting on my bed. And my cat looks at me,
Hmm.
turns on her side, almost like exposing her belly for me to come over and rub it.
Hmm.
And then she meows kind of loud. If I don't get up and go and rub her on her belly, she'll look at me and she'll jump off the bed onto the table, and then she'll climb up and perch herself on my shoulder, and then I'll end up holding her and petting her. I feel like a lot of that relationship is because I actually look at my cat and talk to my cat and pay attention to my cat,
Right.
and my cat pays attention to me. And when I communicate with my cat, I'm in a very basic sense communicating with an equal.
Mm.
Obviously different in a number of respects, but no, but I really do think that, there is something to the way that you relate to something and how it opens up to you. I think it's the same thing with music.
Yeah.
I've felt, I've felt a kind of exhaustion of possibilities on the guitar a long time ago, and man, it really was just like a stuck place in my mind.
Yeah.
My depth of knowledge of what could be done, of the patterns of what there was to be coaxed out of the instrument, was so impoverished compared to now. You do have to go back to learning, and I think that's one of the issues is whether or not we have a kind of open relationship to things, and still having the idea of that we're in the process of learning,
Yeah.
whether it's with respect to playing a musical instrument, having a relationship with an animal or any other sentient being, another human being, how you relate to nature in general. And I feel that's all related to intuition. It's the next level of being awake and being receptive.
Yeah. I get the sense that when intuition is functioning properly, that it's a little bit like the way that art reveals things that can't really be expressed in any other way. It's like at the forefront of being and knowing. It has to kind of pass through art until it can take on like a more of a form that can be enunciated.
And that entire process can even transcend the artist himself or herself. The process of enunciation, the process of creation,
Hmm.
from like Gadamer, the way that he puts it, that when the work of art is actually created, the artist stands in a relationship to the creation similar to that of some other person who's only first beholding it.
Right.
Like that it's like a natural formation.
Yeah, I definitely get the sense after I've finished creating something that that sentence that I've created is not actually correct. That it was somehow brought forth and didn't, at least in a way, really didn't have anything to do with me.
Well, I really want to get deeper in. I haven't read Ibn Arabi in a long time, but I recently acquired the book, The Metaphysics of Imagination, a book I had like 20 years ago or something, and I don't know what happened to it, but I got another copy. But I still remember one of the things that he talks about in that book, which is states. He describes states and stations,
Uh huh.
that you can reach a station,
Uh
and when you reach a state can descend upon you at that station, and the the excellence of the state, in a sense, is not your excellence, it's the excellence of the state.
the excellence of the state is the excellence of the state.
Well, the excellence, if yeah, yeah, that's obviously a tautology. If you reach a station, but there's a state that can descend upon you when you've reached that station,
Uh-huh.
and the excellence of that state is something that you can attribute to yourself,
Mm-hmm.
but that excellent state may be passing. You may only be glimpsing it, touching it,
Mm-hmm.
and then in that process of relating to that excellence as being your excellence, as rather
Right.
it's a matter of being at that station and having that state descend upon you,
Right.
where you can experience a type of contraction, uh, because part of the excellence of the state is that expansion, or almost an experience of being annihilated and then being subsistent in a deeper ground of being. And then through there's a period of being subsistent in that deeper ground and then contracting back to a state you're more commonly familiar with.
Mm. Right. It's like I feel an enchantment, and in that enchantment, I create a piece of music, and then I say that I created that piece of music, but then it's like who or what enchanted me.
Yeah, that's definitely another way of putting it that I think would be true. I mean, I've seen the argument made before that we don't just need great artists, we need great appreciators of art
Mm.
and ways of relating to art, and that includes the artist himself, going back to Gadamer, where the artist stands in relationship to the art like it's a natural formation, like some other person beholding the art.
Right. There's this guy, Robert Henry. He wrote The Art Spirit, which was a book that was really influential on David Lynch. And in it, he wrote, to some degree, every human being is an artist, depending on the quality of his growth. It makes me think that of, what you just said about needing both artists and with great artists and great appreciators. And it seems like they're basically the same thing.
Well, yeah, I mean, I once made a remark about poets identified as being poets, in a sense, being terrible, because I guess, it's kind of an extreme way of putting it, but you can go to a poetry reading with nothing but poets there waiting to get up to recite their poetry, never really listening to any of the other poets. And maybe one of those poets hearing something poetic said by a child or a crazy homeless person or something, and suddenly hearing poetry and wishing. Person who's actually kind of a jackass once said something interesting to me, which is there's nothing less poetic than a poet.
That's funny. Well, it really seems we're hitting on almost another kind of example of a counterintuitive in that the common sense notion of what art is entirely misguided.
Yes. It's kind of like our notion of religion, because, or even, as opposed to religion, some sort of narcissistic spirituality project. They all fall under, in some respect, what Ken Wilber refers to as immortality projects.
Right. Immortality projects. It's like we're like some kind of hairless, albino, half blind mole. and, you know, and we don't really know what anything is.
Mhm.
But yeah, the main thing is that, we should be well regarded and immortal.
It reminds me of a way that this reporter described Charles Manson
Yeah.
as likely to spend the rest of his days just playing mind games in the jailhouse. I think it was Bergman, the filmmaker. I think it was in the introduction. It was in a book. I think it's the introduction to the Seventh Seal.
Uh-huh.
He was saying that a person, he just was describing a situation where a person was basically just trying to convince somebody that he's an artistic genius and how amazing he is.
Mhm.
And the other person is on the verge of suicide.
What did I write about in The Delicate War? Something like that. Like the common conception of a film is that it's a $1 billion superheroes in pajamas extravaganza. You know, it's an impoverished understanding of what film can be. I mean, because you can have those films, of course, but then you can have other films that are artistic in the sense that they can lead you to a deeper ground of being, that they can open up yourself to yourself, that you can inspect and remove more of the opacity. And there really is a hierarchy of art ranging from what I would say are escapes from the world at the bottom to escapes to the world at the top. So, do you want to just try to wing the outro and see what happens?
Yeah, I think winging the outro is a good idea.
We could say, if we were going to record an outro, then maybe we should say this and that.
Yeah, like you've been listening to Phenomenoumena with co-hosts Ray, I am he.
And Gino. Yeah, well, we could do it like that.
Yeah, and then we could direct them to all the places where the podcast would be found. Spotify, iTunes, wherever they are. And, check out our webpage, Phenomenoumena.com. What about using this? Can we use this?
Yeah, I think maybe we should use this.